I kind of wanted to be Baptist like everybody else. And whereas most of you studied yourself into this, I went through a period of time I kind of tried to study myself out. Well, that one didn't work. It was my father worked with Anthony at the Bible college. I've known Anthony just almost 40 years. I went to high school with his daughters, and my dad started working at the Bible college in 1981 and Anthony in 82. So I've known them from a long time, so if you want any dirt on Anthony. But the problem is, if you want any dirt on me, go ahead. But my uncle was at one point chairman of our national board of directors. My grandfather at one point held the position that I now had. My other grandfather has been a pastor in this. So I didn't have any hope of ever getting out of this. But the reality is, the scriptures have always seemed very clear. Because when you find this understanding, you don't have to explain much. I've always communicated with people that orthodoxy seems to be a yes, but theology, whereas ours is a yes theology. Jesus died, I say yes. Orthodoxy says yes, but he was only his human nature. We say Jesus is the Son of God, I say yes. Orthodoxy says yes, but. We say someone's dead, I say yes. Orthodoxy says yes, but. And so it's very simple to explain the scriptures. And as Dick explained it, it's a very simple book. Not simplistic, and there are things to wrestle through. But my story really is one of persistence, I suppose. And when you come here, many of you, it's a little bit, isn't it like kind of going to the Oscars? It's like a who's who of biblical Unitarianism. You're like, oh, there's Anthony. There's Dale Tuggy. There's Sean. Sign my shirt, And I'm like, it's Anthony, And so a little bit, and Anthony and I have talked about this. It's interesting because my experience or interaction with this understanding or this theology is very similar in that it's so familiar that it can, without intention, become unexciting because I've always had it. In fact, I wrote an article not long ago that Anthony said, you know what, that helped me understand something. It's a bit like air. Air is something that is necessary for you to live. But we have it, and so we never think about it. I don't wake up every day saying, oh, wonderful molecules of oxygen. However, when you are drowning and you come up to the surface, you gasp for it like you've never gasped before. That's what happens when people show up at this theological conference, because the truth, when it hits you, it is like the oxygen to a drowning man. But in our churches, our organization in 3 years will be 100 years old. And we've had churches doing biblical Unitarianism for years before that. And so when you get multiple generations into it, you run the risk of following the path of Israel. When they came out of Egypt, it was fresh and it was new and they were passionate. It didn't take very many generations for them to be lulled to sleep. And yet, they served the living God. And so in the same way, as excited as we are in this room, we all run the risk of taking it for granted over time. It's a little bit like being in love. And when you first fall in love, you get up, you go to sleep thinking about her or him. And you're excited. And it is passionate. And you want to tell everybody about the other person. But at some point, you got to get married. And after 10 years of marriage, it's deeper, it's richer, and better than it's ever been. But it's not exciting in the same way. It's more mature. And so for many of us in this room, we experience that first love of truth. In fact, I was telling Anthony, his ministry is so dynamic because it's like a truth dating service. It gets people introduced and they get excited, but once you know that you're right, now what? And there's a difference between being right and living righteously. And there is a maturing to our faith that's necessary. So whereas Anthony can, and all of these other ministries introduce people to truth, it's sort of like truth dating services, I'm kind of like the marriage chapel with the general conference. My role is to help you get married to the truth in such a way that you'll be here for years and years and years. And your relationship with the truth will deepen and mature and be better. So just as Dick gets emotional about Carol, I get emotional about this. I'm not going anywhere. It reminds me of Peter. The disciples, Jesus, things were starting to get hard and they started filtering away, and he looked at his 12 and he said, "You guys going too?" And Peter just says, "Where else are we going to go?" And I always warned people when they would come to our church, I said, "Now be careful when you get this. It's going to ruin church for you, because you won't be able to go anywhere else." And it's such a journey that's been my privilege to not just be baked into this. And I've always wondered, would I be in this? Dick, you said something about you might be Methodist if you hadn't met Carol. And by no fault of my own was I born into this. In 1968, when my grandfather took this, what was I doing in 1968? Well, Dr. Tuggy made the point, nothing. And then, I showed up and here I am. On your tables, I've put a little brochure because I find myself right now sitting in the chair of leadership with the Church of God General Conference, which might be foreign to many of you, and some of you may be familiar with it. But I thought I would at least introduce you if you're somewhat familiar or not familiar, because this is part of my faith story. My life has led me to this point. When I was first asked to take this position, I really didn't want it. I was happy serving in a church. I pastored a church for 20 years. Grew up in this understanding. In high school, did silly high school things. Got serious about my faith in college. Went to school for biomedical engineering and to play college football. And I felt like God redirected me. And so when I tell people I started in biomedical engineering and I ended up pastoring, they say, "Well, how did that happen?" I said, I played for a small college football team, and we had an All-American linebacker on our team, a Division III. And we were going to the national playoffs. It was in Iowa, and it was November. And it gets cold in Iowa in November. And I was just a freshman, and he was a senior. And scout team running against first team. And the guy ahead of me, the All-American linebacker, got yelled at by the coach and kicked off the field for being in the wrong place. But it wasn't the right guy. He yelled at the wrong guy. So when the All-American guy came back, there was smoke coming out his ears. Well, guess who gets the ball? So I take the ball. We're running out this way, and he's like, a bull, and I know he's going too fast. So all I got to do is stop, change, and he's going to go by me. But the ground freezes. And so when I went to stop, I didn't. I just lost all momentum. So he met me face to face, picked me up, took me 6 feet backwards, put me 6 feet under, and broke my face mask. And I thought, maybe I should be a pastor. So the next year, I transferred to what was then Oregon Bible College. And then I went to another school and got my education degree. I taught 8th grade history for a year. And I thought, maybe I should be a pastor. And I did that for 20 years. And then I was asked to come take this position. And I said, I don't know, Joe, how long did you talk to me? It was a long time. Joe would say, "Did you ever think about?" No. "Would you ever consider?" No. 2 or 3 years. And the reality was, well, facetiously I say, you know what, the reality is I loved my church, I loved the people, I loved my worship team, I loved my office, I loved my house, I loved my yard, I loved my mower, I loved the school my kids were in, I loved my life. I didn't want to change anything. And I said, I've worked for 20 years to build up a church that's healthy and vibrant and growing, and I could go the next 20 years and coast. And then I knew I couldn't coast. And for a long time, I didn't feel released from that. And this last year, or I guess I've been here about a year and 4 months, I felt just God had released me from that. And I looked at the history of my life, and I strongly felt like God had positioned me for this. Not only had my grandfather done a good job in this role, but there is a whole generation of people that would at least let me in the door because of his reputation being positive. Then my dad worked at the Bible college for a number of years, and there is a whole host of pastors who have a relationship with me as a middle schooler, but I know them. And then for a number of years, I worked with our national ministry, and so I have relationships with everybody my age and younger. And I just thought, God, I cannot outrun you. So here I am. And it is my firm commitment that the Church of God General Conference is positioned well to catch people and give them a place to land. The General Conference, I won't go over all of this with you, but if you'll open to just the inside page there, just to go over this. The Church of God General Conference is a network of independent churches. In the past, the name Church of God of the Abrahamic Faith was used. And the churches of God in many parts of the world form a unique segment of the religious world with which you should be familiar. And because of your presence here, you are familiar. It is this biblical Unitarian outlook that explains the Bible A to Z. And while small in size, its contribution to biblical understanding has been great. And please don't hear me say that we're the only ones that have this figured out, because many of you are part of groups that are also very clear on this. In many ways, its leaders have pioneered a reawakening in the understanding of biblical truths that were long hidden in the darkness of human traditions. And while not agreeing on every point of doctrine, and this is where I think the Church of God General Conference is a bit unique in the pantheon of denominations. I wouldn't even necessarily refer to us as a denomination, but more a network of churches. Our churches cooperate in the effort to spread the truth that God is one and Jesus is his Son, and that God will establish his kingdom on the earth, and the only way to have salvation, life in the coming kingdom, is through baptism into Jesus, the Messiah. And General Conference churches have the freedom to explore truth on many points of doctrine, and we encourage truth-seeking. And the churches across the General Conference collectively join forces and share resources to accomplish larger efforts nationally and globally, in addition to their local ministries. Each local church is locally governed and autonomous. We believe that Christ is the head of the church, not an organization. And the General Conference is structured to provide support rather than control, and to encourage rather than to manipulate. Participation in any General Conference event, program, or organization is entirely voluntary. And so, what I would love to do is to just simply extend an invitation to you and your group to associate in some formal way with a network of churches. And I believe that there are benefits to that because it gives you access to an infrastructure to support whatever God is leading your group to do locally. And we're looking for more and more ways to help facilitate the spread of truth. Our simple mantra is helping churches and spreading truth. And we look for different ways to endeavor to do and accomplish those things. And so if at any point your group or your family, if you're isolated, would love to just partner with people and have theological conference all year long, we welcome you as a place to land and find fellowship amongst people of like precious faith. Thank you. The next person is not.
Thanks for bringing the students back. I hear